Welcome to the third episode of Breaking Bread, coming to you from NCTV Studios, Nevada County's own community television. I am Patricia Smith, your host for the evening, and in full disclosure, I am the chair of Americans for Safe Access Nevada County. Breaking Bread is an independently produced monthly program featuring discussions of local interest and current events. Our concept is to bring together people of opposite viewpoints to discuss rather than debate hot-button issues that enlighten and illuminate our times. Hopefully we can find some common ground and possibly build on that base towards a better understanding of the issues and each other. And no one can accuse us of shying away from controversial subjects. Last month we tackled Second Amendment rights, and this month we are discussing cannabis, particularly limiting access to minors and the availability of scientific evidence to support the medical claims that our supporters make that it alleviates everything from sciatica to cancer. Our guests today are Don Bessie, a community organizer, very prominent in Nevada County, Dr. Christina Lasich, a pain management specialist practicing in Grass Valley, Shannon Snow, a mother and citizen activist who marshaled a bill through the California legislature allowing palliative care for minors, and Martin Webb, a longtime community activist in Nevada County. So let's set the foundation for our discussion tonight by defining teenage drug problem in Nevada County as you all see it. How large of a role does marijuana play in the overall drug problem, in your opinion? Do you want to start, Don?
Sure. According to the studies done at the schools, marijuana is up there in the top 3 with prescription drugs and alcohol.
Okay.
In my practice and my experience treating people that have chemical dependency and addiction, frequently the common gateway drug is marijuana and alcohol at an early age in the adolescent or even pre-adolescent age. In fact, studies show that at onset of use, marijuana will increase the likelihood of developing addiction or substance abuse disorder in 13, 14, 15-year-olds compared to a 20-year-old beginning marijuana use. And I think that speaks to the effects that marijuana has on an undeveloped brain.
Okay, Shannon, do you have any thing you would like to add about how you perceive the drug problem with teens in Nevada County? I mean, you had a teenage son.
I had a teenage son who all he wanted to do was not do drugs and go to school. I think our teenagers in this county have not a whole lot better to do. They're bored. We don't cherish them as citizens. We need to encourage them to be community members, get them involved in the community, give them jobs to do so they're not bored. I think the marijuana use in Nevada County is from basic boredom. I don't think it's a gateway drug.
Martin?
Well, in relation to drug problems with youth in our community, it's clearly alcohol and marijuana are the top 2 in my opinion. And just like Dr. Lasich says, with the onset of use for both alcohol and marijuana, there's a stronger predictor of substance abuse later, for sure. Research does show that there's a higher risk of youth using alcohol in rural settings and not cannabis. However, I think our community needs to be especially aware of marijuana use of youth because we happen to have a culture that seems to be open about cannabis use and cultivation, whether it's for recreational purposes or medicinal purposes. And I think the adults in our community need to be more aware of too many positive messages, not enough negative messages down to our youth. So as someone that's found it beneficial for my own issues, as well as raising 2 children here. My son's graduating on Saturday from local high school, and it's very important for me to make sure that there's a strong balance between alcohol and marijuana being able to be responsibly used by most adults in the community, but everyone should keep it away from kids, and law enforcement and healthcare needs to focus on the people that have problems.
I did a little research, and according to the State of California Department of Justice statistics, there were 240 juvenile felony arrests for drug offenses in Nevada County for the year ending 2009, which I'm sorry, being the efficient people they are, the most current numbers I could come up with. Narcotics and other hard drugs accounted for 167 of those felony arrests, while marijuana totaled 48. There were 692 misdemeanor arrests that year, which included 388 for liquor laws, 168 for other drugs, and 136 for marijuana. Let's take a look at our first slide, please. As you can see from this chart, marijuana is the only substance that cannot cause death. It seems way too much attention is being placed on marijuana when hard drugs and alcohol are the bigger and more dangerous problems. So I think we can all agree that keeping dangerous drugs out of the hands of minors should be our top priority. Are we in agreement?
Yes, we are.
All
We
right.
can definitely do that, but the question comes in is where it's much easier to address the issues of youth access to alcohol at the sources, at the stores, the mini-marts. The prevalence of grows in the county make access a real issue for how to deal with that. How do we interrupt that supply?
It is an ongoing problem, but I believe that having regulated dispensaries would be a step in the right direction, just as we have liquor stores that keep kids from having access to marijuana. We put it behind locked doors that they can't have access to. That would help eliminate some of the access, in my opinion, anyway.
I don't know. They still have access to alcohol, and most of the access is through family members or friends. And that's also the case in marijuana. I saw a young man who he was given access to marijuana at the age of 8. His mother put a plate of brownies in front of him that was laced with marijuana, and then the rest is a typical story. He began using alcohol and marijuana regularly, and he escalated to opioid pills and injectables. So I think in terms of access, this county in particular is unique because of the amount of grows, as you said, are in the area. And in terms of dispensaries versus going down to your liquor store, it doesn't really make a difference because the kids are getting it from friends and family. And that's where the messages from parents, like you said, need to come into play.
And there are always going to be irresponsible parents and adults.
For sure.
But we do have laws that we can use if they violate those regulations. If you supply liquor to a child, you're looking at a pretty serious offense if you get caught. Maybe we need to make those penalties stiffer, that people would be too terrified to break them to allow access to children, because having regulations seems to be the better way to control it than having none, or having
Actually, the best way to control epidemics in health worldwide has been proven to be education.
I'm a strong believer in education, but I also am not a believer in prohibition. We've seen how badly that has failed on every level.
Well, I think that here we're trying to address the children issue. And I wanted to back up a little when we were talking about education. And I think part of the problem is we've raised a generation of children who have had this message driven that marijuana is the safest substance, and you compare it to peanuts, so that they make this connection that, oh, it's medicine, it's a good thing, it's okay, when they really aren't informed about the potential to damage the development of their own brains.
Go ahead.
That's when it comes to family dynamics. You have to have parents who have rules, and you stick to those rules and you have consequences. I don't think giving a child marijuana forces them into using opiates. You could put a gigantic bag of cocaine in front of me, and if I want to use it, I will. If I don't, I won't. It doesn't matter what other drugs I've ever done before. I don't think it's a steady progression from the drug. I think it's a steady progression because of the family dynamics allowing it.
It's also the person more than the drug. If marijuana was a gateway drug that it is described to be, there'd be a whole lot more hard drug addicts. And there's like 1% hard drug addicts for every marijuana smoker. So if it's a gateway drug, it's not a very effective one.
Well, I'd like to touch on a recent meeting that I had. Both Don and myself are members of the Coalition for Drug-Free Nevada County. And the coalition's focus, while the name sounds fairly broad, its focus is specifically on keeping drugs like tobacco, alcohol, marijuana, prescription drugs specifically out of the hands of youth. And so it's interesting that you have this topic, because last week we had an anti-marijuana subcommittee meeting to actually talk about youth use, and really identified two different things that have to be in place in order for youth to use marijuana, and that is the access, and then the other thing is either favorable attitudes toward marijuana or not enough favorable attitudes about themselves to stay away from it. Because if you have access, but you've got the education and the self-worth that makes you not want to use it, the access won't matter. If you have favorable attitudes towards it, or you've got some emotional issues that make you more prone to using, if you don't have the access, it doesn't matter. And so it was nice to have emotions not so much be a part of it, and not to have dueling research numbers and data. And it was actually just looking at it from a logical standpoint of how are they getting the access, and what can we do to make sure that they have less favorable attitudes towards it and more positive attitudes for themselves. And the one thing I want to mention really quick is when it came to access, we identified 3 different ways that children will get it. And we know that it's not falling from the sky. We know that kids aren't growing it themselves. And there actually is quite a disparity of any proof that children are going in and raiding gardens. That's not something that actually is a problem in the community. But what is a problem is they are getting it either directly from adults, or it's being passed through from adults down through young adults who aren't mature enough or responsible enough to say, I shouldn't get this to the children. So there were the 3 different access points we discovered were, number 1, accidental access. Either an adult who uses it recreationally or medicinally who is being irresponsible or somehow has allowed access to happen. Then there is purposeful access by an adult that's casual in intent, meaning a parent that is giving it to their children, just like many alcohol drinkers in the community give their children alcohol.
Like they think there's nothing wrong with it?
Right. You can have the same stories. We all know that there are extreme situations, people, families, where they're having their children use drugs. So you've got casual, purposeful use. But then the third one is adults giving it to children purposefully for commercial reasons. And those are the adults that are doing it because they need to sell more of a product, and that's how they make their money. And so we wanted to look at those 2 different things. How can we address the access, accidental or purposeful casual, purposeful commercial, and then how to educate the kids so when they come in contact with it, they say no. And personally, for me, I think of drug use as sort of like a contagious disease. My history is I've gone through a lot of ups and downs with drug use, and I grew up on the East Coast, went through a time period of actually being a homeless heroin addict.
Wow.
And I've had a lot of bad and good experiences with issues with drugs, and I can see that this is something that, if used the right way when it comes to whether it's alcohol or marijuana or prescription drugs, you've got to be able to keep this away from kids. And it's a contagious disease because kids don't just bump into drugs. When a child or an adult uses a drug, they get it because they came in contact with another human. So for me, I began to think of this as a contagious thing. So when a child comes in contact with another child or an adult, how can we inoculate them so that when they come in contact with this contagious disease of drug use, that they'll say no thanks, and so that's a
You
little
do
bit
that-
of my thoughts.
You do that by giving them enough self-esteem and something more fun to do.
And those are the very things that the Coalition's youth arm, NEO, has been right at the front in this county on. They provide more activities for more kids than any organization in the county, and they're currently running an effort to get a youth center, a drug-free youth center, somewhere in Grass Valley. And I would encourage everyone to, if they hear about it, talk to the people in the area so that we can overcome any of the not in my backyard that we're likely going to encounter. And let
We
me,
need that.
I think I'm
I would
hearing at this
support that.
table that we would all agree that we should elevate the penalties for providing marijuana to children
Any.
up to the same level as alcohol.
Yes, I agree with
I think that is
But
something we're all
I would
in
like to
accordance on.
address something that you mentioned, that children are raised with the message that marijuana is safe. I think that is not the message they're being given. I think they're being told that marijuana is the same as opiates. And I think that is an extremely dangerous message to give out to children. And I think once they discover the falsehood of that statement, they are more likely to experiment with other drugs, believing that they were lied to about those as well.
Well, I would respond in two ways. First, you have the political ad season. Every time we have a statewide ballot proposition, or like the last cycle we had 5, that you have the issue ads. And the issue ads are directed at voters, but they're absolutely seen by children. And not having personally ever made the connection between opioids and marijuana, I'm not quite there with you on that. But I think that
That's certainly how I was raised.
well, I think
In
the
the school
thinking
system.
now, and given the better science, as opposed to the just say no days, that the science now we can specifically speak to that they're damaging their brain's development. And if they start early and use it regularly, they're going to be looking at an IQ drop. They're going to be looking at hemispherical connectors not developing properly. We know these things, so they're tangible now. And I agree that this broad boogeyman kind of approach is not a successful approach. But if we can push away the political aspects that we see too much of, that we can talk to them about these facts, that we can educate them that yes, at a certain point you will come of age and you can make certain decisions for yourself. But up until that point, society has an interest in you developing to your maximum potential.
I
And this
agree with that.
interrupts it.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I believe that there's many things that are taboo to children that are, adults are allowed to use every day. Children can't vote. Children can't go in the army. Children can't sign a contract. Children can't buy alcohol, cigarettes, or anything like that. So there are things that are appropriate to wait till you become of age. But I still believe that if we're going to educate our children properly, we have to be truthful. And I do not believe that we are being truthful about marijuana.
Right, and there's a subset of children who need this as medicine, who are completely separate from the healthy children.
Yeah, and I
So
think
if
that's
you're
a whole separate issue.
Given a choice
from the
between death
medical.
and a few IQ points, what are you going to choose?
Well, that's the statistical outlier. We're really looking at the broad effect issue, and where the average kid, where their interface, like Martin says, they bump into it, and they don't really have the details. They don't know those facts because we haven't done a good enough job getting that information down to their level. And part of it's funding. Part of it is societal norms in Nevada County particularly. Like I hear from the schools how frustrating it is when harvest season comes and so many kids get pulled out of school, and the attitude that, hey, I'm going to make more money than you when I start growing, so what do I care about this education? And that's a loser on a long-term basis for that kid
It
to
could
grow
be.
up.
It could
The
be.
social norms in our community are definitely slightly stacked against kids' favor. I was looking at the 2012 Nevada County Health Status Report, and the latest figures that they were touting were that 77% of adults in Nevada County are regular alcohol users. That's a pretty large majority of adults that are recreational drug users, because alcohol is a drug, it's recreational, people don't have prescriptions for it. And then when you look at the marijuana community, whether it's medicinal or recreational, I don't see enough peer pressure between adults saying, what are you doing with your kids out harvesting and doing trimming and that type of thing. And that's the type of work that I think remains to be done, is that there is too much of a casualness between adults and children. And one of my frustrations, actually, as someone that has used medical marijuana, is that people are so flaunting about it, whereas I think of it as more of a diabetic. You know, a diabetic that has to shoot up with a needle looks like they might be shooting up drugs. And if you've ever been to dinner with a diabetic, they don't stand up and flout it. Sometimes they'll go to the bathroom and they'll be quiet about it. And for myself, whenever I've used it, I make sure my kids have no clue what I'm doing. They don't see it, they don't smell it, they don't come in contact with it. For me, it's a medicine that I might use, and that I'm partially wanting to keep it out of sight. And I'm disappointed when people are flaunting that this is my medicine and I got to use it in front of my kids and you can't hold me back and that type of thing. And I am disappointed that in our community we seem to have two sides of adults fighting against each other to the detriment of the kids. There's a lot of anti-pot rhetoric that is very exaggerated and just looking at the negative, and then there's the people that then try and respond to it and just talk about the glowing positive, and the kids don't know who to believe, and so they're just going to listen to each other. Oh, we tried this new thing, me and my friend got it, because we're up here bickering, and it's like a dysfunctional family where mommy and daddy are fighting, and the kids are going to start doing whatever they feel is appropriate. And I really feel like we need to keep these issues separate. How can adults regulate this substance to the betterment of the community? I don't believe prohibition is the best use of funds, but that's separate from, we need to make sure the kids know this is something they should not be using, and we're not touting this as a party medicinal thing. So it's such confusing messages for kids that I'd hate to be a kid growing up in today's world in our community, because they're not going to know who to believe, and we should all be uniting and saying this is something that none of you should be doing. Just like driving a car, shooting a gun, drinking alcohol, any of these
We
things
don't let them
are
smoke
dangerous.
cigarettes.
Right.
If I saw somebody else's child smoking a cigarette, I'd probably slap it out of their face.
And so I want to say I'm as disappointed with the alcohol social norms as I am with the marijuana social norms. It paints a bad picture for people who do use marijuana responsibly, recreationally, or medicinally. And it is absolutely one of the worst things you could do to engage your children in growing, selling, harvesting, trimming, that type of thing, unless there's some clear extenuating circumstances where a doctor has agreed this is going to be something beneficial to you. So
I have met parents that believe that it is such a normal rite of passage or a way of life that they're proud to teach their children the trade. They want them to be like if they were dairy farmers or turnip growers. I mean, that's how they look at it, that this is a commodity, it supplies numerous benefits medically for a lot of people, and there's nothing to be ashamed about. And they're trying to bring it into the light instead of making it a shameful thing that people are afraid to even admit they use.
Well, it doesn't have to be shameful necessarily, but an extension of the societal norms. Personally, I think that this evolution of these abuse of prescription drugs, the pill poaching and the pill parties, when I first started hearing about this from the coalition, I was really questioning whether these things happen. But then we have friends in the EMS community. Oh yeah, we see it. We see it. There was a kid at NU a couple years ago. We hear it at the conventions from all over the state, more in the urban areas. But what is getting the attitude that it's okay to take a pill that's prescribed for a third party, throw it into a bowl with other pills, and pluck out whatever you like? And I wonder if the medicine equation on marijuana, part of that message might be confusing.
Well, certainly the research in terms of teenage use and their attitudes towards prescription drugs, they feel that the prescription drugs are safer because they are available by prescription. And so since they're available by prescription, then they must be safe. And unfortunately, that message of medicine being safe for everybody is getting filtered into their decision-making process, and then they decide, well, it must be okay because I know, my dad takes it for his back pain, so it must be okay for me to take it if I want to because it's available by prescription. But I think in terms of education, it's just a matter of educating the children to what happens to the brain when they are under the influence and what happens to the undeveloped brain. I speak to Patty's suggestion that medical marijuana shouldn't be compared to opioids. The problem with that is that the science of the endocannabinoid system in the brain has shown that particularly the nucleus accumbens, which is part of the reward system in the brain, that's where you feel that high when you're doing something you enjoy. You get a dopamine release. That's where you feel that runner's high. That's our reward system. That's the nucleus accumbens. And there are receptor sites in that center of the brain that are specific to the endocannabinoid system. The cannabinoid system is what marijuana is working on. That was first discovered, those receptors are first discovered in 1988. And our body actually produces endogenous cannabinoids, and that our body produces endogenous opioids. And that's what these drugs that we are taking are working on. They're working on our natural system. So if you're looking at comparison, I think there's a lot of places to compare. And with marijuana use, it's been shown that there's a dramatic increase in dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. And that is also true for people that are using, whether it be cocaine or opioids or alcohol. It affects the reward system. Mm-hmm. And so we have to, draw, some conclusions that, hey, these chemicals are affecting the brain. And the problem with the adolescents is the brain is not fully developed. And if you're putting them under the influence of chemicals, whether it be sugar, caffeine, prescriptions, marijuana, we have to be careful because the social norms now are that all these chemicals are okay. I mean, look at where Red Bull is exploding in popularity, and
Red Bull and alcohol.
Right. And if you look back in time, back to the days of the apothecaries, right? Sugar used to be the original drug. They used to be on the shelves of our pharmacies. And now we don't even think of sugar as a drug. But years and years and years ago, it actually was prescribed. And so now we are, now we don't think of that sugar as being a prescription drug. It's just part of our norm. So how far do we push our norm? We've included, alcohol, and we have, our laws about that, and now, how far are we going to go into what's normal and what's just part of our household goods, like sugar?
Well, I find it really interesting because when I was growing up, I was under the impression that marijuana was just as bad as heroin. And I wanted to experiment like many young kids. The first thing I used to get high with was cough syrup because it was a medicine. So I thought it might be healthy for me. That's how.
There you go.
That's exactly the message we have to get to children. That
actually, grade school, they are using cough syrup. That is the primary drug of choice.
Trust me, don't try it.
In grade school. And the dextromethorphan in the DM, Robitussin DM, dextromethorphan, you can go online And the kids can look up, well, okay, well, I want to get to a certain level of high. How much dextromethorphan do I need to take? And
That should be on a math test.
and that is the drug of choice in your, your 8, 9, 10-year-olds, and including the inhalants. Okay, and so that's why we have to be very careful on what we're educating our children on, is what qualifies as a drug.
Well, one of the
very
things,
careful.
too, we start kids on drugs as young as 6 years old now. I mean, in 2002, there was something like 10,000 Ritalin prescriptions. 10 years later, it was 6 million. 6 million. They're giving this stuff to kids as young as 6 years old. They hand it out from the nurse's office. It's nothing but speed. They're giving them a taste for this at a very young age, and I find that very disturbing. And if we're going to talk about relative harm, I would like to bring up the slide from Judge Young, please. We got
I
that
know I'm
one?
going on, but I'd like to talk about children for a couple of minutes, because today our marijuana laws are putting our children in harm's way. We are
Okay. In strict medical terms, marijuana is far safer than many foods we commonly consume. For example, eating 10 raw potatoes can result in a toxic response. By comparison, it is physically impossible to ingest enough marijuana to induce death. It is the safest, most therapeutically active substance known to man. By any measure of rational analysis, it can be safely used when supervised with medical care. On the other hand, every 14 minutes someone dies from a prescription drug overdose. Let's take a look at the Center for Disease Control statistics. Do we have that slide? I guess not. There you go. As you can see, opiates cause 76% of prescription drug overdoses, but people die from other prescription drugs approved by the FDA every single day. And more people die from prescription opiates than from heroin and cocaine combined. If we really want to protect our children, perhaps we should start by banning prescription drugs.
Well, perhaps we should start by managing the doctors. I mean, in California, it's a volunteer registration for prescriptions. When we have people giving out prescriptions like you use the Ritalin, I hear those statistics and I start thinking, is this a management tool for the schools?
Yes.
Is there really that explosion, or is it more, well, it's a problem, let's give them some drugs? So I look at that issue at the doctor end. And for example, I had a prominent local psychiatrist complaining to me that she had a child who was profoundly bipolar, took a major drug load just to function normally, and had a doctor tell him that, here's your recommendation, this will take care of it. So, wow, great, I've got a recommendation, this is going to take care of my problem, goes off the medication with the expected results. So how do we get into that equation with the doctors that are prescribing these things?
What remedy do we really have? I mean, a doctor...
Should there be a registry? Should they have to
They
document?
do have a registry, don't they? It's a
For Schedule 1.
No, they don't. And it's voluntary in California. Some states, like the reason Florida had the explosion in pill factories was because of their weak regulation of doctors. I mean, we all heard major pharmaceutical companies and large drug chains had these warehouses trucking OxyContin to Florida on a non-stop basis.
Talk to Rush Limbaugh.
And all the local states adjoining Florida were driving in, buying it, and taking it home. And what happens to that? It gets sold, it gets diverted, ends up in the schools. So at some point, we are going to have to address the issue of the people making the prescriptions and the recommendations, and are these really medically sound? And like you look at a lot of the states now, some of the more modern evolution into medical marijuana, like Illinois and some of the eastern states, where they've gotten a lot stricter about what qualifies for a recommendation, and there are no recommendations recommendations for children unless, like in your case, it is an extreme life-threatening issue. Stress in high school doesn't qualify for a recommendation.
But they will give you a pill for that.
Should
When
they?
you're in, but they do.
Should they?
But they do.
I understand, but where we're having the conversation is we should be talking to the doctors who are doing it. Should they be doing it? They can, but should they?
You're a doctor. What do you think?
Well, I certainly say that there are a lot of doctors that are not prescribing responsibly in terms of opioids or otherwise. It requires diligence from our profession. It requires monitoring tools like prescription drug monitoring tools that aren't being utilized widely enough. And I hope that my profession continues to recognize that at some point there needs to be a clear understanding of what's appropriate and what's not, and how to monitor for safety and efficacy. I want to get back to Patty's discussion about safety. And certainly consuming marijuana by itself in terms of mortality seems to be relatively safe, but there are other issues of safety that come to mind when discussing drug safety, and particularly for marijuana in younger people. It comes down to their decision-making process, their executive functioning. We know that the frontal cortex in teenagers is very undeveloped. They have a hard time making good decisions anyway in terms of risk taking. But it's been shown that under the influence of marijuana in functional MRI scans, that the activity in the frontal cortex is dramatically different than in teenagers that are not under the influence of marijuana, including those that are abstaining from marijuana. There seems to be a lasting effect in the frontal cortex, and that is affecting what we call their stop-go decision-making, their risk assessment decision-making. And so I shudder to think of teenagers being even more apt to take risks and less apt to weigh risks and benefits. And we know that under the influence of chemicals, including marijuana, that executive functioning, their ability to make decisions, is impaired. And that affects safety in a different way.
And that's why family dynamics comes in again. And this also, I wanted to say, humans are not the only animals that like to alter their consciousness. People take drugs because it feels good. That's the bottom line. We see birds eat fermented berries, elephants get high, monkeys. Humans aren't the only animals who want to change their state of consciousness.
What I believe also is that there's usually an underlying reason that so many children want to use drugs, maybe an undiagnosed medical condition, ADD, depression, low self-esteem. There's a reason that some kids gravitate towards drugs and other kids don't. Mm-hmm. And if we can find those underlying causes, perhaps we can alleviate some of this. And another point I want to bring up is that, especially when it comes to marijuana, that oftentimes the prohibition causes more damage to the children than the actual use of the drug does. And I think we probably can agree that prohibition has not worked. It has done nothing to reduce supply or demand. It hasn't. Every year we put more money into it, and every year the supply and demand goes up. We've spent more on incarceration than any country in the world, and what do we have to show for it? Not a whole lot. I think that we need to change our approach to more education and treating drug use as a medical problem rather than a law enforcement problem. Can we see that clip of Judge Gray that we started to see before? And
Before we get to that, can I respond?
Sure.
The facts are, in California, with regard to marijuana and incarceration, the prison population, it's less than 1%.
Oh.
And you're talking, but for use, well, we can debate the statistics, but the use issue versus dealing. And dealing is a crime. It's a federal crime. And if this is in fact a medical marijuana regime under 215, 420 that we're operating under, we don't have prohibition in California. We have a medical marijuana structure. And if you want to have a 100-acre farm of marijuana, well, you're running a risk. And if you're going to make millions of dollars and not report it, you're running a risk. And those are choices they make. But again, we're talking about kids now, and part of the equation is access. And so the dealers who get busted for selling to kids, I frankly believe they should be in jail.
I'm talking about prohibition towards children. And when a child gets arrested for marijuana, they cannot get a college loan. There's so many hidden penalties attached to this that causes them more harm than trying to keep them from using the drug in the first place. We need to find a better approach that works.
I think
That's
in
all
the
I'm
real
saying.
world that
It
we're seeing
works.
more infraction-type sightings like here recently at NU, where for the one adult, it was an infraction. So even though they believed there were sales, they didn't feel they were going to take it to trial, and they had an infraction. An infraction does none of those things.
No, but those 200
That
and
case is
something,
unusual because
very
they actually
unusual.
had no evidence that that adult did any sales, and there was no evidence that he actually came in contact with the officer. And so they had to admit that they actually arrested him and didn't have any evidence that he was involved in sales. And my son is good friends with that gentleman's younger brother. And it devastated the family because they lost their father a few years ago. He fell from a second-story construction site, and their family was already struggling, and this was absolutely the wrong thing to do. And they acknowledge, if you go back and look at the union news reports, they admit that, and Stephen Munkelt said, there was absolutely no evidence he met the person, no sales whatsoever. They got a search warrant for the person's home and found a very small amount in his home. So no evidence of sales, no payo sheets, no large amounts, and that was actually probably the worst thing they could do to him 2 months prior to him graduating. But one of the most important things I want to get out on the airwaves that I think people would be surprised about in relation to teenage youth marijuana use is I would encourage everybody to simply Google this phrase, Google medical marijuana laws and teenage use. And you'll discover that repeatedly studies done on every state that has passed a medical marijuana law, when you look at teenage use before the law was passed and after, every single state, teenage marijuana use has gone down after a medical marijuana law was passed. And there's some confusion out there because anti-pot folks will spread this statistic that says in states that have medical marijuana laws, teenage use is higher. And in the most recent study done in September 2012, they say that that state exists, that state of being existed before any medical marijuana laws were passed. So they're saying that, yeah, in these states, teen use has always been higher. But if you're talking about what are the effects of medical marijuana laws, you have to look at the time before the law and the time after the law. And in every single case, not only did teen use not go up or level off, it always went down. So it would seem to indicate that one of the ways to encourage teens to not use it is to present it as sensible regulation as opposed to, hey, this is an awful thing, don't touch it. And then kids get in contact with it and then they doubt. We're talking about everything. The Institute of Medicine did this very thorough report in 1999 that anyone that's paying attention to medical marijuana is familiar with. And they were tasked by the federal government to look at all of the available research and all of the issues. And when it comes to the concept of it being a gateway drug, They emphatically said there is nothing that demonstrates that this drug by itself has some sort of physiological reaction that leads to further drug use. It is the prohibition policy that actually is the gateway policy. If you had to go to a drug dealer to buy bread, and the drug dealer also offered you all these other things, you're probably going to see a spike in people using these other things. And so they've actually discovered that the prohibition policy is forcing otherwise law-abiding citizens to come in contact with substances they might not otherwise want, pushed by people who are looking to make money and get people hooked. And so, you know, the research is just so filled with conflicting things, and most adults have no clue that actually until recently the federal government refused all research unless it was only looking for negative effects.
They still do.
Absolutely would not allow anyone to look for anything positive, and if they were looking for negative effects, they were forced to use the government's own supply, which has been acknowledged to be very poor quality and unhealthy for people to use.
Speaking of which,
Yes.
Most drugs, people are familiar with most drugs, before the FDA will approve them, drug makers get to use their own product and pay to have their own research, and then the FDA reviews that.
Right.
When it comes to marijuana, total opposite. All of a sudden,
Absolutely.
logic is turned on its head. You can't use your own. You can't look for positive things. And so the research has been extremely skewed and biased for several decades. And it's only recently that in America we're seeing research done on are there positive effects. But internationally, there's a lot of
You have to get permission from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the DEA, and the FDA before you can conduct any study on marijuana in this country. It's almost impossible to get those three agencies to approve a study looking for a favorable outcome from marijuana, whether it's a cure for cancer or not. To me, it's a crime against humanity. And I wanted to make a point that I have a friend named Irv Rosenfeld who gets medical marijuana from the federal government, and he has been for over 3 decades. This is a tin that he gets from them every single month. And these are cigarettes, because I didn't want to bring marijuana to the set, but this represents what they ship him every single month. His average daily dose is 10 cigarettes a day, what comes to a half a pound a month. This is quantified and codified by our government as a safe dosage. And it's the same marijuana that you were just talking about.
Actually, I was acquaintances with another recipient of federal medical marijuana, and she specifically would never use it. She would actually hand it out to responsible adults that wanted them as sort of like a, you know, something to put in a glass case kind of thing. She said it was absolutely horrible and made her chest hurt and made her sick, and so she would find, you know,
On the
better
studies
quality.
issue that you were bringing up, I'm not so sure the relevance of the 1999 study anymore, given as much science and long-term study that's happened since then. But I would point to the coalition analyses in the school surveys are at odds with your representation, particularly here.
What's that?
That the use and perception of harm after 215 and 420, that use went up and perception of harm went down.
So you're saying you have numbers from 94, 95, and 96 compared to 97, 98, 99? Because that's what
I don't
we're
have all
talking
the
about.
years at the tip of my head, but I'm talking about the numbers that we have going forward are showing that it is increasing. And in Colorado, the numbers of people going into rehab that are teenagers went up markedly after they brought in their medical marijuana. And in addition, one of the problems that I wanted to bring up today before we run out of time is how do we
rapidly
deal
approaching.
with the pass-through effect, where you have an irresponsible adult who gets a recommendation and passes through to minors like we talked about earlier. Because in Colorado, after a couple of years, they were self-reporting in rehab. 75% of the kids were saying they got it from an adult who had a recommendation. How do we deal with that unless we have strong penalties for people who do that?
Well, there should be penalties for adults giving any drug to any child. That goes without saying. And I think
Penalties
that
are only useful if you get caught, though. I just wanted to interrupt
well,
and
if
say
you're in
you can have all
rehab.
kinds of penalties, but it goes back to education. And
Everything does.
Every law enforcement officer will tell you there's no way that they can catch everybody and enforce these laws.
But the instance he was talking about is people being reported in rehab. There is a direct line that could be prosecuted if they wanted to. and I believe that they're using drug rehab. I've been studying this for 45 years. I mean, I think I'm pretty familiar with the ins and outs of medical marijuana use, and I will admit it can be habituating, but it is definitely not addictive in the true sense of the word. And it makes me crazy when people lump it together with drugs that are addictive, because that sends, again, the wrong message to kids.
What's your definition of addiction?
Addiction is not being able to live without a substance like heroin. If you go without it, you are going to have remarkable physical symptoms.
So what you're actually describing is dependency. Dependency and addiction are clearly very different entities.
I don't think that is defined well enough to children.
In the medical community, it's very well defined.
But are children medical experts?
Right. So our job is to define it. So dependency is when you are taking a chemical for a sustained period of time, your brain undergoes changes enough that if you were to stop taking that chemical, you would go into withdrawals.
Or death.
Right. And that's dependency. Addiction is more of a behavior where you continue to use a chemical despite its ongoing harm to your life, your way of being. It causes dysfunction, as opposed to someone who's appropriately using chemicals. It's causing an improvement in their function, like your son. It improved his function. But in addiction, we see dysfunction. They lose their job, they lose their house, they are stopped performing well in school. So addiction and dependency are very, very different entities. Now, in terms of physiologically, it's proven by hands down that marijuana does cause dependency. It does lead to withdrawal symptoms. And this was proven in 2006. It's clearly defined. There is a...
Can you cite the study?
Well, the new psychiatric guidebook includes marijuana dependency.
Don't you think that they're fishing for business? I mean, this whole thing
I don't think psychiatrists need to fish for business.
I'll tell you
There's plenty of crazy people.
There is no reason for drug rehab for marijuana. They get that as a diversion from going to jail. You get a choice. Do you want to go to drug rehab? Do you want to go to jail?
Well, maybe not. If you've got a 12-year-old and you're worried about their IQ fully developing and you want to put them in rehab to break the cycle.
You put them in rehab. Nobody voluntarily goes into drug rehab for marijuana because there is no problem.
I think the doctor could speak to that better than I.
Well,
most of the time when we're dealing with drug rehab is that there's multiple substances, so it's kind of hard to tease out. And marijuana is typically a substance that they're on, but they're also using other substances. In speaking to people that have been using marijuana for a long period of time, and my clients also, it's very difficult for them to stop that habit, and they do experience problems with withdrawals from abstinence of marijuana.
Is that across the board, or is that
rare
anecdotal?
No, actually 60% of people that are using marijuana on a consistent basis will experience at least one symptom of withdrawals.
Like what?
Anxiety, insomnia, loss of appetite. Those are all part of the withdrawal syndrome. 30% of people that are consistently using marijuana and suddenly stop will experience at least 3 symptoms. And so there's not a question of whether or not it causes dependency, because we see the changes on the functional MRI scan in our reward center, like I talked about before, in the cortex, in the hippocampus. So the brain, the reason why the brain changes is to keep things on an even keel. And when you suddenly withdraw a chemical that it's used to, then it will suddenly go into off kilter, and it has to reset itself. And that's basically what happens when someone goes into withdrawals.
Has anyone died from marijuana withdrawal like they do from alcohol?
No.
I hate to do this, but we are almost at the end of our time here. Does anybody want to throw out any last-minute comments? And is there any area that you feel we've come to any kind of meeting of the minds?
I think we have found commonality on a number of issues with regard to access. Penalties for diversion should be up there with alcohol, that our concerns for education and getting the right balance in our education for our youth on how to properly address marijuana in their life are all things that I feel we were common on.
I do too.
And that's a really good step today. I think that was, for a 1-hour show, I think we got a lot accomplished.
Thank you.
I wish we could do this again and talk about this even more. We didn't even get to the second half of our topic, which was the scientific evidence that supports medical marijuana. And we had some really great clips. Maybe we can address that again sometime. Martin, did you have any final comments you'd like to share?
My last comment is just when it comes to marijuana, I think that if anyone looks at the research, the average user is not a chronic long-term user, and that marijuana is just like alcohol and a lot of drugs. The majority of adults are responsible users, and that a policy of prohibition unfortunately spreads out all of the law enforcement funding to go after everyone, as opposed to, I feel like we really should focus on keeping it away from the kids, taking care of the 9 or 10% of users that become dependent, and going after the criminals that are harming our community. And this buckshot approach of, well, let's go after everyone, is diverting money away from kids, keeping away from kids, and going after the real hard cases. So I wish everyone would really consider that when they think about marijuana.
Okay, I think we're down to our final minute here. I want to thank our panel, Martin Webb, Shannon Snow, Dr. Lasich, and Don Bessie. I think you provided some really interesting and provocative things for us to ponder, and hopefully everybody out there in the audience learned something as well. And we will be back next month with Eric Toom. He will be doing a show on climate change, again, another hot topic. I want to thank our crew and our cast, and NCTV for providing the production facilities for us. And until next month, take some time to break some bread with your family and friends.
It's not the barley or the wheat. It's not the oven or the